Evening, everybody. This is DrHack, and the voting is closed, guys. The results are in. The King's Indian has won. Hooray. You guys picked a really tough one for me, but it should be very rewarding in the end. So, let's do this. So there was a comment on the last video of the Caro Kann series where a viewer noticed that I didn't explain a piece of theory very well, that when a bishop captured a knight. And luckily for us, that is the driving piece of strategy behind the entire King's Indian defense. So I get to circle back and pick up that question, kicking this off, and also get you guys started right onto your King's Indian stuff. So let me get to that first. So what we need to do is we need to understand at a very deep level the difference between the bishops and the knights. And this has everything to do with the Feng Shui of the chessboard. How the furniture is arranged and how the lighting comes in, and how easy it is to move about. I want you to take a minute, pause the video if you have to, decide whether you like the white bishop better or the black bishop better. Just use your intuition if you don't know. Pick one. Okay, so when you think about a bishop, its power comes from its mobility. It has to be able to get around the board, but that's only half the story, getting around the board. The second half of the story is what it runs into when it runs into something. So this bishop is extremely mobile, right? It can move to a lot of different squares, no problem. But whenever it runs into something, it always runs into its own stuff. And it never runs into white stuff. And that is a big problem for that bishop. He's only got half of the stuff he needs to be somebody, right? Now you look at this one. And he's also only got half of what he needs to do to be somebody. He can't move around the board very much. As a matter of fact, he's only got one square total. But every time he runs into something, it is always the opponent's stuff. If the rook were to move, he could even run into a knight, right? And that means that this bishop is the offensive bishop. And for us amateurs, we know offense is greater than defense. And so this one is the one that I would choose every time, okay? Now, the value of that piece, the utility of it, we know it's worth 3 points, and it can be worth more than 3 or less than 3, depending on how useful you think it is. And so if you thought this piece, being able to attack that, was very, very useful, you might give this piece an extra half point. You might say it's worth 3.5 in your head. And that's more valuable than the other pieces. You don't want to trade it anymore, right? And that's an interesting way to think about chess, that the values of the pieces bend around a little bit, depending on how useful you think they are. Now do the same thing for these knights. Which one do you like better? Now this is one that when students come into me, I would say 1 out of 15 actually understands this before they get there. So this is a very rare bit of understanding, I guess. Although it seems like it's, once you see it once, you don't forget it, right? So this is the one I'm going to rip the pieces off the board for. Let's take a look at this. So when you start the game off, the bishop starts on the back of the board. We know it's mobility based. It can reach exactly these squares. We're gonna use it as a proxy to understand the knight. Okay, so the bishop can reach 2 squares on the opponent's half of the board, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares on its own half. That's pretty good. I would say that's a fairly useful thing. This knight, though, he can only reach 3 squares total, and they're all in his own half of the board. If you were to ask me which one is more useful right now, I would say the bishop is. So the bishop is greater than the knight at the beginning of the game. Okay, makes sense. We all have been told that, right? Bishops are greater than knights. It somehow gets embedded in our minds pretty early on. What happens when you move the knight one time? Look at those circles. That's where the knight can move now. He can move to 8 different places. 2 of them are on the opponent's half of the board. That sounds familiar. That sounds like what we just said about the bishop a moment ago. And it is. So now if you were to ask that same question, which one of those 2 pieces is more useful, the answer is much more cloudy. Okay, we don't know anymore. They're pretty close. And so as we move that knight up the board, each time we move it up a square, it seems to get more useful. Now it's attacking 4 squares on the opponent's half of the board, clearly more than our proxy bishop was at the beginning of the game. But what we're going to do now is we're going to compare it to itself. Was it better than itself was down here? Yes. So it definitely got plus value. And we could do it again. We can move it up the board again. and it gets a little bit more value. Now, it didn't get more squares in the opponent's half of the board, but these two places, that's where the pawns start. And maybe you can attack the base of a pawn chain. That seems a little bit more useful, possibly. And you move it up the board again, and now it's reaching the places where the rooks hang out. Ooh, right? And those are tier 2, tier 3 pieces. They're bigger than the knight. So now the knight is messing with bigger pieces than himself. That is super useful. And he's also attacking the base of the pawn chain. Right? So as the knight progresses further and further up the board, he gets more and more valuable. The knight's power comes from his positioning on the board and how long he can maintain that positioning. And you can actually draw a little square around here. And you can say the knight is the most powerful inside of that square. Because if we were to move him up another square, he would start dropping some of the places he could move off the top of the board, right? These two would drop off the top of the board. And so he'd only have 6 squares he could move to from here instead of 8. So the knight is the most powerful inside this box, and we can also say that the knight is more powerful the further up in that box that it goes. Okay? It doesn't necessarily matter left to right, but it does matter from top to bottom. Okay. Good stuff. So now that we know that, let's come back to this position. I'm not going to leave you hanging. I'm going to show you what happened in this game. This was one of my games. But I have a plot twist for you. I was not playing white. I was playing black. So if you liked all of white's pieces, we're no longer friends. Okay. Good. And my opponent took this pawn. And I was ecstatic. I was so happy that I just lost a pawn. Now, I did lose a pawn. That's not the happiest thing in the world. But I got rid of my worst bishop, my worst minor piece. And if you look at the two knights, the black knight is clearly the better one now that we know what we know. He's reaching the places where the rook wants to go. Think about this. The rook wants to defend the pawn? No, can do. The rook wants to attack my rook? No, can do, right? The rook wants to come up and defend the pawns? No, can do. That knight is doing all of that just by being. And so he trades off his best minor piece. Okay? And now we look at this and we go, well, look at this move. How will white ever defend this pawn? And the answer is, he will not. And as we go a little bit further into this, we realize that because black's pieces and his knight, because it was so good, he's starting to take all of white's pieces and pawns off the board. And he's starting to get ahead. If we go back to the beginning and we see what maybe my opponent should have done, what white should have done, maybe what he should have done is he should have said, okay, this knight is extremely useful, and maybe I should find a way to remove it from the chessboard. So perhaps the move would be something like this, and after black makes a move, which is quite difficult to find a move for black, then we can play to remove the knight and make it get worse. If it hops backward, it's now worse than it was a moment ago because its positioning is further back on the board. I think white would have had very good chances to win this game had he played this way. But that helps us to understand how the bishops and the knights interact in the King's Indian. Now let's get back to the King's Indian and let's start this thing, Okay, so I want to take a look at some of the moves of the actual King's Indian now. And the first thing that I want us to understand is that there are some moves, or there is a move, we'll call it, that if white plays, we are going to be unable to take our game into the King's Indian. The King's Indian is defined as soon as we place the dark square bishop on g7. Okay, and if he plays a move like this one, exactly this move, it's called the Trompowsky, and we were to go into our King's Indian, he could absolutely shred our kingside pawns, and this would be not a good version of a King's Indian for us. Okay, and we don't want to see this, we don't want to play this. And so we're going to have to learn a secondary opening based on exactly this move. Okay, but all of the other moves that can come, we can keep this in the world of our King's Indian, so that's happy, right? That's very happy. And so I'm just going to play this one for now, but we will come back to those weird second moves. We will come back to the third moves. Okay, and we're going to get into our actual bishop going up here, because I want to understand what happens when we put the bishop here. And I want you to remember something, that there is a thing in chess called the space left behind. A piece cannot do what it was doing, and then it moves and it does what it is doing also. No piece can do that. They always leave something behind whenever they move. And so when a bishop moves from here to here, it was working on this diagonal, and it is no longer. Now it is working on this diagonal. And so what I want to draw your attention to is exactly these 4 squares. And since we're looking over there, let's look at these ones below him, and let's look at this square as well, and this one. Those are the squares that the black bishop is almost certainly not going to reach in the near future. And that means that if white aims all of his pieces at those squares, he has superiority there, and he can cause some real trouble. Now, the ones that really kind of strike me are these two, because those two you have pawns on, and they are very deep in your territory. Those are weak places. Just like the other openings, we want to know where our weak places are. Well, there they are. Okay? And as we go further into this, we're going to understand that since we gave those squares up, we're going to have to look at them directly and take care of them like they're our own children, those squares, as we go forward into our attack. We're going to leave it there for now. I do hope this helps somebody, and we'll keep building on this strategy in the next one. I'll see you then. Take care now. Bye.